welcome to the History Slam podcast from Activehistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live in Ottawa, Ontario, where we just had Canada Day. And, of course, today is the 4th of July, Independence Day for our American friends. And we figured what a better time to invite our friend Paul Kahan back to the show, because he has written another book, The Presidency of Ulysses S. Preserving the Civil War's Legacy, and he is joining us from Philadelphia, I presume, Paul.
Yes, that's correct.
So welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
And happy Independence Day to you.
Thank you very much. As soon as we're done here, I'm heading out to my brother-in-law's and enjoying the traditional barbecue and fireworks display, so I'm looking forward to it.
Right, eating and blowing stuff up, the great American traditions. Does
it get any better than that?
It really doesn't, and I hope the weather's better for you here in Ontario, at least. A scorcher for Canada today, so hopefully it's a little more comfortable where you are today for Independence Day. So let's talk about the book, and I say this to you pretty much every time we talk now, is that you embarrass the rest of us by just being so productive. This is the third time you've been on the show within 2.5 years or 3 years or something with another book. So this one is about Ulysses S. Grant. But how do you keep doing this, Paul?
I don't sleep a whole lot, and I have a very forgiving partner.
Which is key, of course. And this one is a little different from your other two that we've talked about before. I mean, you've always, everything that we've talked about has been 19th century, but, Amiable Scoundrel, it was pre-Civil War, of course, and now you're looking at the legacy of Ulysses S. Grant, who's one of these figures that is very prominent in the United States, but someone who, as we'll talk about, isn't really that well known outside of maybe the military context. So where does this idea for a book about his presidency come from?
So that's a really interesting question. The answer goes back to my previous book, the biography of Lincoln's first Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, titled Amiable Scoundrel. After Cameron leaves Lincoln's cabinet, he ends up being reelected to the Senate and serving in the Senate for the entirety of Grant's presidency, during which he ascends to the chairmanship of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, where he works, if not hand in glove, then certainly very closely with the administration in implementing Grant's foreign policy. And in thinking about that and thinking about the role he played, I really wanted a short, accessible narrative history of the Grant administration to sort of give some context to Cameron's activities. And unfortunately, there was no such book. The biographies of Grant that exist, all of them very fine, nevertheless give short shrift to Grant's presidency. And so as a result, as I was writing the book, I felt somewhat handicapped. And I sort of tucked it away in the back of my head that, there'd be a really important area of study to create a narrative history of Grant's presidency. And so ultimately, for my sixth book, that's what I did.
And how much is that lack of work on his presidency a part of the United States' overall fascination with the Civil War? Because, I like to joke that a new book about the Civil War comes out every 10 minutes, and for as much as it's a joke, sometimes it feels true. Like on late night talk shows, whenever they bring out an author, it seems as though it's a book about the Civil War. So how much is that romanticism of the Civil War influenced the historiography of Grant being so heavily focused on the military aspect?
Well, that too is a really interesting question. On the one hand, it's undeniable that the Civil War is the focus of a lot of scholarship. And in fact, some Civil War roundtables that I've contacted about speaking to them have turned me down on the basis of the idea that a book about Grant's presidency is not, strictly speaking, about the war. I take the longer view that if war is politics by other means, then Grant's presidency is the war by political means, because his presidency is mostly about consolidating and protecting what was won on the battlefield during the war. That being said, Grant himself tended to downplay the war. He writes what is really the benchmark of presidential memoirs shortly before his death. And the irony is that book stops in 1865. He doesn't talk about his presidency. He doesn't talk about his world tour after leaving the presidency. It's almost as if his life ended at Appomattox. And so, Grant is partially responsible, I think, for this sort of scholarly attempt to ignore or diminish his presidency. And certainly because he was president during Reconstruction, there's this whole anti-Reconstruction impulse that runs through the historiography of the 19th century during the late 19th century and then, really the first, I would say, 2/3 of the 20th century. And, as a result, it's only been relatively recently that we've begun to look back on Reconstruction as something other than an utter failure. And all of those things, I think, sort of came together to sort of diminish Grant's presidency in the eyes of scholars and the general public.
Yeah, because it seems to me that with Grant, his presidency is sort of almost an extension of the Civil War or something. Like, people don't really pay that much attention to it because, the Civil War is such a benchmark event in American history, and Reconstruction is so contentious and almost stretches beyond his years in a way that sort of the resolution of the way in which Reconstruction is going to ultimately play out seems to sort of bypass him. And he's almost treated in the historiography that I've read, and certainly if you pick up textbooks from even 10 years ago, they don't really talk about his presidency. He's sort of a minor figure outside of the war. And it strikes me then as maybe not so much a repudiation of his presidency, but more so just the way in which Reconstruction has been written about and understood, or in the case of me, and I think some of the textbooks, and frankly, not understood.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that if you think about, sort of the one book on Reconstruction, it's Eric Foner's History of Reconstruction. Yeah. And that takes a very state-based narrative. It tends to ignore what's going on the federal level, and he sort of depicts Grant as almost a non-entity in a lot of ways. And I think that even for someone who didn't see Reconstruction as a flawed experiment or as an utter failure, he nevertheless creates a template for thinking about Reconstruction as sort of, not really requiring the president on some level, as what happened in the states, not what was happening in Washington. And I think that there's some value to that approach. But, what I think I argue in the Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant is also, it's important to look at what was going on in Washington and look at the structural and political constraints on Grant as president. And, to get a better sense of how policy not only got made, but was also implemented from Washington. So, I think that there's a necessary corrective to the story that involves understanding Grant's presidency on its own terms.
Yeah, absolutely, which is interesting in that, so much of the war and so much of the arguments about the war since have been about states versus federal rights and who is responsible for what. And you're right in that Reconstruction is very much viewed on a state level and a state-by-state level. So let's get into this a little bit with Grant. Coming out of the war, he becomes the president. He's elected president. What is his principal policy or platform that he's running on? What gets him elected other than the notoriety of being a major military figure coming out of the Civil War?
Well, and that is actually what gets him elected.
Right.
It's important to understand the political context. The Republican Party is relatively young at this point. It's less than 2 decades old, and it's a very loosely bound together coalition of people opposed to slavery, and on a spectrum. Those who were opposed to slavery but didn't believe that Congress could really do anything about it, to flat-out abolitionists who demanded immediate emancipation. And the end of the war faces the Republicans with an identity crisis. A lot of them are saying, okay, well, we got what we wanted. Is there really room at the table for a Republican Party? Is there a necessity for a Republican Party? Or can we go back to being Democrats and Whigs? And it's really antipathy toward Andrew Johnson that in some ways gives the party a second lease on life. It sort of provides them with an enemy that they can all rally around, and ultimately undoing a lot of Johnson's policies and ensuring that the South doesn't weasel out of what happened on the battlefield during the war, really gives the Republicans a second lease on life. And so when they begin casting about for a candidate, they're essentially looking for someone who's got enough popularity that he can attract votes, but at the same time, he's inoffensive to the various factions of the party. And no one fits that bill better than Ulysses S. Grant, who had made an enemy out of Johnson, who as general of the army had been responsible for implementing Reconstruction policy during Johnson's presidency, and who ultimately is the most popular guy in America at this point. And so as a result, they sort of choose him from a strategic perspective. And his campaign is summed up in the campaign slogan, "Let us have peace." That's really Grant's goal going into the presidency in the beginning of 1869. And, I think somewhat foolishly, he thinks that he's going to be able to be president without dealing with politics, that on some level he's going to be above it all. And, there have been plenty of presidents who have gone into the presidency thinking that, only to have, the cold water of reality thrown on them. And Grant's first year in office is very frustrating because he doesn't quite know the rules of the game and how it works. And it's only when he sort of gets with the program in 1870 that things really begin happening for him. And he's able to exert control beyond, executive prerogatives.
But what sort of things did he want going into it? Like, I get that it would take some time to figure out the actual machinations of the government and how things work. I mean, you could make a parallel to what's happening now in terms of there being a steep learning curve and understanding how to actually get things done within the government. But in Grant's case, it's one thing for there to be this divide within the party and people settle on him as a candidate, but at some point he would have to have ideas and have some sort of motivation to do this, as opposed to just being, well, there's no one else who everyone can agree on, so I'll do it. Because in that sense, he would almost be like a figurehead, and from everything I know about Ulysses S. Grant, he wouldn't want that. Like, sort of a obviously, if you're going to be a major military figure, there's sort of a stubbornness to you, right? That you're in control, you know what's going on, and you have power. So the idea then that he would just sort of be this guy who everyone can agree on and almost the least offensive, to me would go against that idea, and therefore he would have to have some sort of ideology that is underpinning everything he's doing, right?
Well, and in the book I argue that the guide to understanding his political identity, is sort of a moderate Whiggishness, that he identifies with the Whig Party in the 1830s and 40s, and then, basically that leaves a lasting impact on him when he begins thinking about what he wants to do as president. And there are several definite goals that he has. One is improving U.S. relations with Native Americans. One is finding an answer to the ongoing challenge of race in the United States. To the degree that he has a well thought out platform on money, he's a bit of a gold bug, which has a faction within the Republican Party. So it's not. I don't want to suggest that he's a total cipher by any stretch of the imagination. But what I do want to suggest is that his primary motivation for running is consolidating and protecting the achievements that the Union Army had won on the battlefield that he believed were being squandered by what he calls the mere politicians who are running things in the years following the end of the war.
So in those years, of course, with Reconstruction, as I mentioned before, one of the more complicated points in American history, and certainly for me, I've taught American history surveys before. I find them difficult to do Reconstruction because it is a rather complicated era. So before we get into actual like the grant part of it, I think the way it tends to be looked at is North wins the war, they want to get rid of slavery, they run out of money, they let the South do what they want, segregation. If I could sort of sum it up in a very simplistic way, I think that's the general narrative that people like me who are not specialists have about Reconstruction. Obviously, when I teach about it, I'm a little more detailed about it. But, generally speaking, is that the narrative that permeates, and what are the major flaws with that narrative?
I think that, like all narratives, that's simplistic, but it does have, in this case, it does have a grain of truth. I think that it's important to recognize that, going back to the structure of the Republican Party, this was a party that was formed to advocate for an end to slavery. But within that, there are a variety of factions advocating, different approaches, whether it's gradual emancipation, whether it's immediate emancipation, whether it's sort of maintaining the status quo and opposing the expansion of slavery. So right off the bat, you have varying degrees of commitment to abolition. You have varying degrees of commitment to equal rights for newly freed slaves. And then you have a whole spectrum of opinion on the other issues of the day, whether it's monetary policy, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's Reconstruction. And it's important to recognize that Reconstruction means more than just, consolidating the gains of the war or doing something for, freed slaves. It meant a thoroughgoing political, economic, social, cultural transformation of the South. Because, the critique of slavery was not just, well, you've got this slave system and everything else is fine. You had this slave system that permeated everything else. And so you uproot slavery, but you don't uproot all of the economic, political, cultural things that go along with it. So Reconstruction is, this really big project. We would call it nation building. And, if our experience in the last 30 years has taught us anything, is that nation building is incredibly expensive, is incredibly unpredictable, and unless you prep the population that's doing the nation building for the fact that it's going to take years and sometimes decades, you very quickly lose their support. And when, it comes to paying the bills for these things, when it comes to enfranchising African Americans, when it comes to a long-term military occupation in the South, the North just doesn't have the stomach for it. In a lot of ways, it's a lot easier to sell the idea of we are going to bring the states back into the Union than it is to say we are going to spend millions of dollars to change every aspect of their social, political, and cultural institutions. And I think that when you do I think that white commitment in the North to that was shaky to begin with, and then when you get to the Panic of 1873, the bottom just falls out. In addition, the primary instrument of affecting those policies is the military. And the military leadership, by and large, makes it clear that it's not committed to that sort of thoroughgoing reconstruction of the South. And as a result, you have subordinates who drag their feet implementing policies and are not as zealous as they probably could have been. And so as a result, you have this policy being set at the top that by the time it filters down to the bottom is not being pursued the way that the president and his administration might have wanted.
And that's one of the things that I think is so important in talking about Reconstruction, really anything else, that it's great for people at the top to have policies, to have ideas, but you're right, they have to be implemented in some way. And the thing with slavery, as you mentioned, that it's not just a system of labor. It's really just this whole way of life that permeates everything. And in some ways, the impact of slavery is still there. If you look at, say, the wealth divide, racial wealth divide, the root of that can be traced back to slavery. So the thought that with Reconstruction, slavery's gone, we'll do some little things, make sure that black people can vote, and everything will be great. It's just, it doesn't work, especially ideologically with former slave owners. Because if you can have the position that the people who you are enslaving aren't people, right? They're property and they're to be treated as property. How then can you say all of a sudden that they would be equal members of society? That is such a huge shift that, I mean, not to sound sort of fatalistic about it, but you almost have to wait for that generation or two later to be able to implement anything like that. And even for that to work, the generation that was the slave-holding class can't really influence that next generation on their ideology. You basically just have to wait for them to die, and then maybe you can make some progress. It seems so short-sighted just to think, well, let's put the military down there. And even if the policies are implemented as directed, I can't imagine it being all that successful.
Well, and that's sort of a counterfactual example,
Well, yes, it is. And I know counterfactual, we probably shouldn't do that, but I did.
I'm willing to go, far down that rabbit hole and ask those questions, because I think there are important questions. Was Reconstruction fated to fail, or were there scenarios where it could have succeeded? Were there scenarios where, we don't have 160 years of, racial problems following it?
Right.
And I think that's a tough question. The willingness, the federal government takes a very conservative response under the Lincoln administration to freed slaves. Johnson winds that back even further. And here comes Ulysses S. Grant, where we have a very tepid political commitment to doing this in terms of white Northern support. You have individuals in the government, both on the military side and the administration side, who are not necessarily as committed to this or outright hostile to it. And so as a result, I think it's pretty clear that under those circumstances, Reconstruction was going to fail. Had, Grant removed Sherman and put, someone who was a little bit more zealous in command of the army, maybe it would have been a different discussion. But, to do that sort of thoroughgoing nation building, you have to accept that there's going to be violence, that there's going to be a long-term economic, political commitment, and that you're just going to be there for a while. And I think that if our experiences in Vietnam and Korea have taught us anything, it's that, U.S. commitment to that sort of thoroughgoing reconstruction tends not to exist.
Right.
When you consider the fact that where it has worked out is in a place like Germany, and we're still there 70 years later. It's hard to imagine the federal government summoning the political and will and economic resources to occupy the South for 70 or 80 years.
Yeah, and especially constitutionally and sort of the principles of states' rights and all that would go against it. So what happens then? You mentioned the economic collapse in 1873, and certainly that is a major turning point in what happens. But is it as simple as that, where support is already kind of waning, economic collapse, 1873, and people in the North just say no more?
No, there are a lot of things contributing to that. There are a lot of, that is one thing that certainly imperils the Grant administration's ability to act. Shortly thereafter, the Grant administration loses control of the House. Democrats take control of the House for the first time since before the war, and they begin investigating the Grant administration. They begin checkmating the Grant administration, holding up the purse strings and whatnot. But even the Republicans in the Senate and to a lesser extent in the House are less committed, I think, to the sort of radical transformation of the South that is going to be required to achieve Reconstruction's ends. The more conservative Republicans, the ones who were more willing to accept the status quo and join the party because they didn't want to see slavery expanded, are kind of saying things like, guys, this is too far. This is too much. We got what we wanted. Slavery is abolished. Let it go. It's important to note that in 1872, Grant doesn't run against a Democrat. He runs for re-election against a group of Republicans who come to be known as the Liberal Republicans. And they're essentially, what their platform is, we hate Ulysses S. Grant. So he's got a very divided Republican Party. He's got a restive public in the North. He's got declining economic resources. Congress is paring back on appropriations to the military, which is the primary vehicle for imposing Reconstruction on the South. So, it's a lot of different things. I don't think it's any one thing. But certainly when you have the collapse of 1873, that puts another nail in the coffin of Reconstruction.
But with all those things going on, one of the things that I'm always fascinated that military figures are so prominent in American politics. It's waned a little bit, but traditionally to be the president, you had to have some sort of military service. Right? If you look at presidents just for the last 200 years, a lot of them, well, the vast majority of them served in the military at some point. And one of the things that I've often wondered is if that actually helped protect the presidency from some of the politicking that would take place. That obviously they're politicians, and most of them are very good politicians, but that military background to say almost this is what's right, this is what I want to do, I have to play the game a little bit, but honestly this is what I stand for. And I've often wondered if that's the case. And with somebody like Grant, who, as you mentioned before, comes in almost as this not objectionable figure, would he have any strong predisposition to Reconstruction in the first place, that these things that are going wrong with it, including then the collapse, make him say, okay, well, I wasn't really into this anyway, let's just pull the plug?
No, I think that I think it's pretty clear that he was committed to the Reconstruction of the South. He does have conflicting priorities, and that's something I discussed in the book at great length. On the one hand, he really wants to have peace. He means it when he says, let us have peace. On the other hand, he's unwilling to buy peace at the cost of giving up battlefield victories and at the cost of giving up the victory in the war. And so as a result, you're constantly pulled by two, in some ways, mutually exclusive goals. The goal to put the war behind us and rebuild the nation as quickly as possible, and the goal to consolidate and protect everything that was won on the battlefield. And so as a result, there's almost a sort of schizophrenic approach to policy making. He is willing to, on the one hand, forgive and forget for many former Confederates. On the other hand, he's unwilling to allow them to terrorize African Americans or disenfranchise African Americans or, actively oppose the Republican governments in the South. And so as a result, I think it sort of militates against a comprehensive and coherent policy in dealing with Reconstruction.
Is any of that personal, though, for him, saying, I was involved in this, I did this, some of my men died doing this?
Oh, absolutely.
So does that then almost sort of take away from any ideological sense of it and trying to quote unquote do the right thing, as opposed to, as you say in the title, preserving the war's legacy?
No, I don't think it's personal, and I don't think I do think it's on some level personal. Grant is not, as I read him, ideological. certainly not in the sense of a George W. Bush or a Ronald Reagan. I mean, he doesn't have a comprehensive worldview that, through which he filters the experience, the data that's coming to him. He is very practical and pragmatic. And again, that too, I think, militates against a coherent policy. He doesn't come into the White House with a checklist of, a long platform of things that I want to do. There are some things, but it's not ideological. It is personal. And, he sees the Army as the instrument of achieving these things because it's an institution that he knows and trusts. And so as a result, he tries to make the Army the primary driver of his Indian policy, which, causes some problems late in his presidency.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because in terms of Reconstruction, if one of the things with the Civil War, of course, is ending slavery, and obviously that's a good thing to end slavery, but certainly throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and now 21st century, indigenous people have not really been treated particularly well. So now here we have Grant, who on the one hand is fighting the Civil War against slavery, is doing these Reconstruction policies, trying to implement these Reconstruction policies that are designed in part to help African Americans. And yet, on the other hand, you have his approach to indigenous people, Native Americans, that is just, it's sort of almost non-existent, to the point of like, just get them out of here. So is there, like, why is there that contrast that he has seemingly sympathy for one persecuted group but not for another?
Well, I disagree. I think that actually he has a great deal of sympathy for Native Americans. He appoints the first Native American to major office, Eli S. Parker. And one of his clearly thought out approaches to policy has to do with Native Americans. He sees the Bureau of Indian Affairs as thoroughly corrupt. And so he wants to get rid of Indian agents and replace them with evangelical Christians and Quakers. He wants to transfer control of Native American affairs to the War Department because he believes that A, the Army will follow orders, B, it will execute policies in a less self-interested fashion, and C, will be less likely to stir up conflict with the Native Americans because they're going to be the ones who ultimately would have to fight in those conflicts.
Right.
And we can debate whether or not his approach is positive or negative, but I think that, again, he is committed toward improving relations with Native Americans. And there are some signal successes. I mean, he does, on some level, root out some of the corruption in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He does ultimately lower the amount of violence, particularly during his first term. Whether that amounts to a good thing, capital G, capital T,
right,
is, I think, an issue for some debate. And of course, we do have several important conflicts. And ultimately, when, his priorities, in one case, improving Native American relations and doing right by the natives, and on the other hand, acquiring gold in order to expand the economy, come into conflict, he chooses gold over Native Americans, and so orders the Army into the Black Hills, and basically forces Native Americans off the land that his administration had promised them. So, on a certain level, I think it's wrong to say that he is unsympathetic to Native Americans. I think it would be more accurate to say that as a president, he's faced by a series of competing priorities and ultimately makes decisions. And we can debate whether those decisions are moral or immoral, correct or incorrect, good policy or bad policy. But I don't think that we can debate whether or not, on balance and in a vacuum, he does care about Native Americans.
Okay, but when push comes to shove and he has to make priorities, the prioritization is always that Native Americans are going to come second in two things. And I mean, that's not necessarily to impugn Grant. That's the way every president has ever done it. But it strikes me as that he is in a sense, working hard on behalf of African Americans, and yet we have this other group that whenever it comes into conflict with another idea or another priority, they're always going to come in second place.
Well, but I would point out that there are also instances where, when competing priorities require Grant to put African Americans in second place. There are times he doesn't effectively use the military to protect the rights of African Americans and Republican office holders in the South, either out of political considerations or out of economic considerations. There are times where African Americans are, end up in the second class status in his decision making. And it's one of the most infuriating aspects of Grant's presidency, in that there are these inconsistencies. There is no consistent policy.
Right.
And Grant, on the one hand, demonstrates what can be done through judicious and aggressive use of federal power in crushing the Ku Klux Klan. He demonstrates that the federal government has the ability, has the power, has the tools to achieve these things, but he doesn't consistently do that. And I think that that's one of those moments where, you sit back and say, that's where you sort of say, where you really wonder what might have been if he had been more consistent in his application of force.
Right.
But there are all kinds of political considerations and policy considerations and, economic considerations that militate against the use of power in every instance. And so I think that, when we begin to think about not just Grant's presidency, but presidencies in general, what we need to do is recognize that it's not just, the president says, do it, and it happens. There are all of these structural problems that shape policy, and then there are all of these functional issues, whether it comes to staff, resources, implementation, etc., that conspire to shape policy in ways that I think are much more complicated than seeing the president as, the buck stops here.
Right.
The buck doesn't necessarily stop at the president's desk.
Right. So let's also talk about foreign policy, because this is something that, in addition to just not talking about Grant's presidency in general, foreign policy is just completely gone in this era. People just focus almost exclusively on Reconstruction, but you've gone and looked at the foreign policy because you think that this makes up an important element of his presidential years.
I do. As a matter of fact, Grant, who is generally regarded as one of our worst presidents, ironically enough, had a Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, who was generally regarded as among our best secretaries of state. And in fact, the Grant administration is able to rack up sizable wins in American diplomacy, most notably in improving relations with Great Britain and settling long-standing issues going back to the war, and then, even some things before that, and really paving the way for the so-called special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. I don't think it's too much to say that had the Grant administration not dealt with these issues, the FDR-Churchill relationship would have been very, very different. And you're talking about, 70 years later. So the Grant administration, I think, does have some signal foreign policy achievements. It also has several failures, most notably the failure to annex Santo Domingue, today's Dominican Republic, which Grant saw as a safety valve for dealing with racial tensions. He wanted to take over Santo Domingo and basically encourage the United States black population to migrate there, because he, like almost every president before him, was looking for an easy fix to America's racial problems. And so if we can just send them somewhere else, everything will be fine.
Right.
Obviously that's a very simplistic and offensive approach to these things, but it nevertheless was the approach that the Grant administration chose to take, and it did have some defenders, most notably Frederick Douglass. Supported the annexation of Santo Domingo as a territory and then later as a state for America's black population. So there are some successes, there are some failures. But again, we tend not to think much about foreign policy until we get to the Spanish-American War. And I think, one of the things that the Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant demonstrates is that tensions with Spain had been going on for decades prior to McKinley's presidency. And you can really begin to see the outlines of that conflict in the late 1860s and early 1870s.
And it's one of these things, too, that I think in the historiography, and obviously you know this space better than I do, but people think of the United States as very much an isolationist power during, or maybe not even power yet at this point, maybe emerging power. But my argument has always been that just doesn't hold water, that from the 13 colonies even, moving west is an expansionist thing, that's not being isolationist. You mentioned the activity in Santo Domingo, but also everything that they do in Central and Southern America is very much a expansionist thing. That the United States has never truly been isolationist, and yet people like Grant and similar presidents, especially through the middle of the 19th century, it seems to me, they don't really have their foreign policy examined because of this myth of isolationism.
No, I agree with that. I think that that's exactly right. I think that, the Civil War on some level sucks the oxygen out of the room.
Right, yeah.
And the antebellum period, sort of in the lead up to that, and, even the Jacksonian period, we tend not to deal with the foreign policies of these eras, except in very incidental ways. We tell the story in a very continental United States centric way. And, obviously there were foreign policies. Right now I'm working on a biography of James Buchanan. And one of the things that differentiates this biography from previous biographies is how situated in the foreign policy realm the story is. Because, of course, in addition to being Secretary of State, Buchanan also serves as Minister to Russia, Minister to Great Britain. He holds leadership positions in Congress on the relevant foreign policy committees. So, in thinking about these things, foreign policy does play a role. And even from a domestic standpoint, one of the biggest political issues of the Jacksonian antebellum periods is the tariff. And the tariff is nothing if not a foreign policy issue. So, I agree with you. And I think that, in writing about Grant's presidency, I wanted to bring that to the fore. I wanted, people to understand that, foreign policy does play an important role, even though this book is mostly about, the Grant administration trying to consolidate the spoils of the Civil War. That had a foreign policy dimension. And it impacted the foreign policies that the Grant administration chose to pursue.
And one of the things, though, that's interesting about it is the relationship with Great Britain, as you mentioned. Why the focus on Great Britain? Because, obviously it's still a major power and arguably the world's largest empire, but it seems to me that there's so many places that you could go and talk to and have relationships with, and from my perspective, at least sitting up here in Canada and learning about empire history from a Canadian perspective, the possibility of war with the United States wasn't really there. So why then go into this relationship with Great Britain? Why that focus?
That's a really good question. Part of it has to do with Great Britain's role during the Civil War. The Lincoln administration had always feared that Great Britain would aid the South during the war. And in fact, a coalition of British powers had placed an emperor in Mexico with the idea that, they would kind of take a wait-and-see approach to the war, and if there was an opportunity to exploit American weakness to establish a European foothold in Mexico and in the western part of the United States, they would do that. In addition, Great Britain had paid lip service to neutrality, but at the same time, the Confederacy had bought British ships that they then put into combat and inflicted casualties and property damage against the Union. And because the Union ends up winning the war, there was the sense that Great Britain owed the United States something, should indemnify them for having not really been particularly above board in their dealings with the Confederacy. In addition, you have a large Irish population in the United States that is really antagonistic toward the British and is an important voting bloc. And at the same time, you also have some conflict between the United States and Canada over borders and fishing rights and, all of these sorts of things. So, there are a lot of areas of potential and actual conflict between the United States and Great Britain, and settling those issues, or at least creating a framework for improving relations, I think takes a major potential enemy out of the mix.
And how much of that, too, is being a military guy, seeing what happened in the Civil War, and coming to some sort of decision that, hey, maybe a diplomacy is a better way to go?
Well, I don't think that Grant is a military fetishist.
No.
But at the same time, he wants very much to invade Mexico and kick the Europeans out of Mexico because he believes that they are a threat to U.S. national interests. And in fact, Johnson tries to rid himself of General Grant by proposing that Grant put together a military force and go do that. And Grant actually seriously considers that idea. He sees former Confederates and Union officers serving together in Mexico under the banner of the United States as a really important step toward reconciliation. It's only when he realizes that Johnson is trying to get him out of the country to weaken him politically and to reassert presidential control of Reconstruction that Grant ultimately demurs. But, it's not for lack of faith in the mission or, lack of interest in, going and, kicking the Europeans out of the United States. I think, nevertheless, he recognizes that a war against Great Britain is not what the United States needs in the 1860s and 1870s. And, I give a lot of credit to Hamilton Fish as Secretary of State, who manages to play off the various factions in the Republican Party against one another and craft a very important treaty that ultimately not only gets the United States what it wants, but improves relationships between the United States and Great Britain.
And how much of that effort goes towards ultimately what the book is about in terms of preserving a legacy of the Civil War? It seems like these things actually do go hand in hand more than you might think on the surface.
Absolutely. I mean, the major complaint between Great Britain and the United States is, these claims over the Alabama, which is one of 4 ships that British shipbuilders had made and sold to the Confederacy. So right there you have a direct connection. This is a leftover legal political issue from the war that needs to be settled. But on a deeper level, I think that, settling the relationship between these two countries frees the Grant administration to pursue its expansionist policy in the Caribbean, which, as we've seen, was driven at least in part by a desire to find an easy fix toward, to Native American, to the black population. And, so there are all of these competing elements that can trace their lineage back to the Civil War, or to issues raised by the war.
Excuse me. So, in general, I mean, the book, of course, preserving the Civil War's legacy, and you mentioned before that Ulysses S. Grant, generally considered one of the poorer presidents, and I realize it's fool's gold to say, good president, bad president, because a president has so much to do and is a rather complicated figure. But in general, how much do you think Ulysses S. Grant maybe is misunderstood as a president?
Oh, I think he's incredibly misunderstood.
Yeah.
I mean, by himself, in particular. I mean, in his final message to Congress, he apologizes for his presidency. He says, mistakes have been made, as all can see. And I mean, it's shocking to think about a president of the United States telling Congress anything other than, we're killing it, we're crushing it, and here's what I want to do, to crush it more. I think that there was some fatigue with the presidency by that point. I think when he writes his memoirs, it's one of the reasons why he ultimately elects to leave the presidency out of the memoirs. And I think that, as Reconstruction sort of becomes this rallying cry for Southern ethno-nationalists, to point to, alleged black inferiority, of course, the person who's president during that is going to take a historiographical beating. And, throughout the early part of the 20th century, that's what happened. Grant pushed too hard. He went too far. Reconstruction was a mistake. He shouldn't have done that. Conversely, when we get to the 1960s and we start seeing the scholarly consensus about Reconstruction shift toward if there was a failure in Reconstruction, it's that it didn't go far enough. Grant is pilloried for not going far enough.
Right, yeah.
Should have gone farther. And you add to that the fact that, published, the scholarly annotated published version of Grant's papers appear relatively late. Late 60s through the 1990s. The papers of his presidency, really don't appear until the late 90s. I think it becomes easy to sort of tell the story from other people's perspectives, whether, it's former Confederates or disenchanted Northern Republicans, and they have a uniformly negative story to tell. It's only really as those papers become available in the last 15 to 20 years that we've begun to reassess Grant as president. But even today, if you pick up, these incredible biographies that are coming out about Grant, whether it's Chernow's or Ron White's, you still see comparatively more space devoted to the war than you do to the presidency, even though the presidency lasts 8 years and the war lasts 4.
Right.
So you got to ask yourself, in terms of, fidelity to Grant's life, in terms of fidelity to relative importance, are we actually being serious about Grant's life? Certainly the fact that Grant apologized for his presidency and didn't write about it in his memoirs suggests that maybe we are, but I take a different perspective. And I think that we need a standalone volume in Grant's presidency for just that reason, if for no other reason than to acquaint the general public with his presidency and with this really crucial time in American political, economic, diplomatic, and social history.
Yeah, and that's why everyone should go get the book. Again, it's The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, Preserving the Civil War's Legacy. A lot of really good stuff in there. And I know it's always dangerous to say this, but parallels to today in some ways too. So it's not a book that's just about Reconstruction or just about the legacy of the Civil War. I think there's some really relevant things going on to the political, economic, social situation in the United States today. So that's what when I went through it and talking to you, I really think that it's a very timely book as well.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
So we encourage everyone to go get it. Paul Kahan. You can find him on Twitter. And one of the things, I always forget to do this at the end of shows, but Paul's a pretty good Twitter follow, I have to say. You're always sort of tweeting out stuff about the books, but also where you're going to be and different anecdotes and stuff. So a really good follow. Is it what is it, Paul? Is it just Paul Kahan?
Paul_Kahan.
Paul_Kahan.
Just Paul Kahan, you'll get the famous chef in Chicago.
Which probably is also a good follow.
Also a good follow.
Yeah, so you probably
we interact. It's always a good time.
Yeah, so there you go. So Paul_Kahan, Kahan. So we encourage you to follow him. Paul, thanks so much for the time today. Now go eat some terrible food and blow something up.
Thank you very much.
All right. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is @Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.